Over the last 9 months, President Trump has been bullying the world, and doing so with unprecedented success. As we know, the main vehicle for that bullying has been tariffs. Now, in principle, the US president doesn't even have the power to impose tariffs. That is the preserve of Congress. But Trump's main tariffing frenzy drew from the claim that by declaring, frankly, bogus emergencies, Trump gained the authority from the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, IEPA. And that claimed authority has basically been interpreted to be a superpower used on a whim by the president. And as you know, it started with a bang. A bunch of tariffs worldwide for all of the other countries, except for Russia for some reason. That means all those countries now have to come crawling to the United States to negotiate better rates. That came on the dubious contention that the mere fact of having a trade deficit counted as an emergency. But very quickly it became like Trump was just an Olympian god, sitting on his golden throne, hurling thunderbolts from the heavens at anyone who vaguely even annoyed him. And as it did so, it became more and more disconnected, even from the bonkers rationales that had been claimed. So, zing! India won't nominate Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize? Well, eat tariffs. Kaboom! Brazil is prosecuting Donald's mate Jair Bolsonaro, 50% charges on your goods. And zap! Canada did an advert pointing out Ronald Reagan didn't like tariffs. Well, there's another 10% on top for you losers. Not only that, but when Trump really didn't want the International Maritime Organization from passing a measure that he disliked about climate change, he had his people threaten the various member countries with, yes, you guessed it, additional tariffs, as well as sanctions against the individual delegates if they didn't vote the right way. Now, you might conceivably have been able to argue that, for instance, the tariffs directed at Mexico, Canada and China that were supposedly in response to fentanyl coming into the United States, that was a response to a kind of genuine emergency. I mean, it's arguable, not a slam dunk. But it's plainly just dumb to argue that Brazil prosecuting a buddy of President Trump's constitutes an emergency for the United States. It is mind-bogglingly ridiculous to suggest that Doug Ford of Canada running an ad featuring Ronald Reagan constitutes an emergency for the United States. And that is de facto what's being claimed. Now, this case was held to be clearly unconstitutional overreach in both of the lower courts that it passed through on the way here. And it has been highly anticipated in how this is going to play out at the Supreme Court, because while the heavily conservative majority of the court have favoured Trump on just about everything that's come before them so far, often on an emergency docket basis where the decisions are limited, don't have to be explained, in this case they will have to make a proper ruling. And in this case as well, the gulf between what the Trump administration is claiming and where the clear thrust of the law as written actually goes, they are so far apart that the ultimate test here is the American rule of law. If the Supreme Court finds a way to talk itself into siding with Trump on this one, it would de facto signal the end of any sort of meaningful constitutional governance in the United States, at least for the time being. The Constitution grants Congress tax policy. Tariffs are taxes, of course, and it did so explicitly to constrain the power of the executive. If that fails, then you have rule by executive decree, unconstrained, all-powerful, which is what we've had for the last 6 months, since April the 2nd, certainly. And let's face it, it's been pretty rubbish for the world. But while the case is extremely weak for the administration, Trump has been ramping up the temperature, arguing that for this case to go against him would be economically catastrophic for the United States. Literally life or death of a country, he said. A disaster of biblical proportions, rivers and seas boiling, 40 years of darkness, the dead rising from the grave, human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together before being eaten by marauding immigrants probably. Without this measure, he said, we are virtually defenseless against other countries who have for years taken advantage of us. That, of course, was during the period of history where the United States had the best performing economy in the world. But it wasn't literally sucking the life out of all of the other countries like a vampire. And that's what Trump has tried to rectify. The pressure is on the Supreme Court this time. Trump is making it clear he really cares about it. And as we know, neither he nor his MAGA base are very tolerant or forgiving when the judiciary don't give him exactly what he wants. As we know, he will bully decision makers in advance for them to do exactly what he wants. The phrase, hang Mike Pence, is evidence of how badly it can go if it doesn't go that way. Hence why this case is the test of whether any of America's institutions are going to stand up to Trump when their back is to the wall. Now today, in the oral questions for the case, it seemed pretty clear that the justices, including key conservative ones, were being pretty sceptical of the arguments made by the Solicitor General John Sauer. Key questions. The President is not granted revenue-raising powers via taxes. Well, said Sauer, tariffs are not taxes, but they are regulatory devices that only kind of incidentally raise revenues, almost by accident. And the justices called this out. You want to say tariffs are not taxes, but that is exactly what they are. Chief Justice Roberts was able to point to the President's own boasts, although to be fair he didn't actually name him as he did so, saying that the tariffs had reduced the deficit. Trump could likewise have been quoted saying, my tariffs are going to raise up trillions and trillions of dollars, which makes it pretty unambiguous that it is seen, yes, as a revenue-raising tool. The justices pushed on the use of the IEPA statute, pointing out that it was designed and intended to limit presidential authority after President Nixon's prior use of tariffs, not to grant wide powers to do anything the president wanted. Justice Gorsuch also pushed to identify that there is a part of Congress's authority that is not delegatable to the president. He pointed out that if the president had the powers that he claims, they should be subject to oversight by Congress, except that Trump would be able to veto any resolution cancelling the so-called emergency, so it's not meaningful. And this was a point that Trump-appointed Justice Amy Coney Barrett returned to, clearly in frustration at the administration's claims. Also, she asked, why was the administration taxing, say, Spain or France, that were not foreign threats to the United States? These were the essence of the challenges to the administration's case. It was widely agreed amongst various experts who were watching on, posting on social media, that Sauer's arguments on behalf of Trump were, to quote economic historian Phil Magnus, a train wreck. In response, the other side made the basic argument, this president has torn up the entire tariff architecture. That is not something the president has the power to do. On the basis of the tone of questioning, you would say the ruling on this case is going to go at least 6-3, maybe even 7-2 against Trump. Now, of course, the tone of questioning is not necessarily the final word on how the decision actually goes, but if it does reflect the outcome, it will be pretty huge as setbacks go. In the short term, it would be chaos, a complete mess. Because tariffs paid so far under this device, all of that would have to be repaid. Now, you will have heard that the administration does have a plan B. If these powers turn out not to be usable, the administration has options to put other tariffs back on. There are other devices the president could call upon, as he already did, for instance, with the tariffs against steel and aluminium specifically. But the administration itself has been clear that these other measures are simply not as powerful as the ones that they're currently claiming. The president's lawyers said this in a letter to the Federal Circuit. Tariff authorities other than IEEPA that the president could potentially use are short-term and not nearly as powerful. Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick also added the warning to that court. Without the viability of IEEPA tariffs, the United States would be weakened and lose the essential tool to address this national emergency most efficiently. It's quite likely that if Trump is so determined, a patchwork of alternatives would be constructed over time to put the overall tariff burden back where he wants it. Maybe not all falling in exactly the same ways, but generally. But the use of tariffs as a punitive tool of intimidation, the ability to threaten that tomorrow you will be walloped with a new measure just because Trump personally doesn't like the cut of your jib, that would likely be gone. And this is what he's really afraid of. If Trump simply wanted a stable state of higher tariff rates, he could have pushed that through in a measured way involving Congress where appropriate that would have been watertight. But Trump doesn't want a stable anything. The fear of major upheaval, on his word, that's his leverage of choice. He wants always to have you know that he can crush you economically if you take a single step out of line today. It's not trade policy that's at stake. It's Trump's ability to cosplay the role of emperor of the world in a way that the world actually goes along with. And they have been going along with it in a way that Trump gets enormous validation from. Just the latest example today, to add to all the others we've discussed in the past. After Trump expressed his displeasure at Colombia for contradicting a claim made about American strikes on boats in the Caribbean, European leaders have been pulling out of a summit with Latin American states that was going to be taking place in Colombia. Ursula von der Leyen, Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, they had all been scheduled to go, and they suddenly gave their excuses and withdrew. Why? Well, the Financial Times put it like this. EU officials are wary of upsetting Trump for fear of unravelling a shaky trade deal struck this summer. Such pathetic displays of weakness feed the beast, and they keep coming thick and fast. Now, no doubt they won't immediately suddenly stop if the Supreme Court strikes this power down, because there are other levers that Trump has, not least in relation to Ukraine, which they also care about. And let's be honest, many of the leaders are cowards. But with such a huge setback, it's entirely likely more countries would start to join Brazil and Canada and China and India in pushing back against Trump bullying and standing up for their own sovereign rights. The court is likely to render its judgment before the end of this year, and it is the most consequential thing we're likely to see happening during that period.